Peace, everyone. My name is Mark Winston Griffith. Let's take a look at some slides we have looking at Central Brooklyn and the rise of charter schools there. So in Central Brooklyn, which is parts of Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights, what we find is that 76.7% of students who are currently enrolled there are actually black. And so there's a lot going on racially speaking. Enrollment for traditional public schools has actually decreased by 41.8% over the last 10 years, and enrollment for charter schools has increased by 530% over the last 10 years. And with that context, let's go to the A block. At the heart of the debate around charter schools in Central Brooklyn are issues of race and real estate. What is the most effective mix of educational options for public school children, particularly for those from black and low-income families? Is there such a thing as too many charter schools? And as more white and affluent people move into Central Brooklyn, how do traditional public schools ensure that long-term residents can enjoy the benefits of gentrification? Here to help us answer those questions are Max Friedman, researcher and Brooklyn Deep contributor, who has recently been looking closely at demographic and enrollment patterns throughout New York City, and specifically in Central Brooklyn. Max, welcome here to Brooklyn Deep and Brooklyn Live.
Thanks, happy to be here.
So let's just jump into it. We've looked at the slides. We have a sense of what's going on in Central Brooklyn racially and in terms of charter schools. I think what's important to bring up from the beginning is that in Community School District 16, what we recently saw is that the Community Education Council of District 16 called for a 2-year moratorium on the opening of charter schools, and the Department of Education actually granted that moratorium. So give us an idea of what's going on there. Why is a historically black neighborhood calling for a moratorium on charter schools?
Well, there has been a rise in charter schools in New York City and all over the country, actually, over the last 10 years, which has been facilitated by the local government, state government, federal government. A lot of important people have been behind the charter school push.
Right.
And you have seen that in New York City especially, really concentrated in poor neighborhoods and in communities of color. So in the South Bronx, you have an incredibly high concentration of charter schools, as well as in Central Brooklyn in District 16, or in District 13 and District 16 and District 17, actually. So in District 16, which you're talking about, which is about half of Bed-Stuy and a little sliver of Crown Heights,
right.
You have seen the charter school enrollment going up, traditional school enrollment going down, and they're about to meet in the middle. Okay. So if you look at it, you'd see that those lines are about to cross, and there might actually be, without action by the DOE or the CEC or whatever, there might actually be more students in charter schools than in traditional schools.
Right.
And so the sort of question is, well, what's the problem with that, right?
Right.
If kids are getting a better education in charter schools, who cares? I think the position of the CEC, which for those people who don't know is an elected.
Please explain what the CEC is.
Right. So the CEC.
For those of us who throw acronyms around a lot.
So. From 1970 until about 2002, the beginning of the Bloomberg administration, each district was administered by a local school board. And then when Bloomberg instituted mayoral control, they got rid of the local school boards and they replaced them with these community education councils, which have far fewer powers than those local school boards had, but they are elected. I think they might be elected actually just by the PTAs of the different schools as opposed to by the population of the district as a whole. But they are elected and they have some powers over zoning and student assignment. And they have the power to make recommendations on matters such as this.
Right.
So the problem with charter schools for the CEC is that all schools are funded on a per pupil basis. So every time you get let's back up a second. Here's how the process works, really. Let's face it, the schools in District 16, to parents who have the wherewithal to make choices, such as, I'm going to send my child to a school outside of the district, to get a scholarship to go to a private school, parochial school, or now to a charter school. District 16 schools have not had a good reputation among those parents for a long time.
And why is that? What's wrong with District 16?
Well, the way that we measure these things is usually by test scores. The test scores aren't good.
Okay, the test scores are not good.
I think there's an image in popular culture that's pretty common to areas like Bed-Stuy of these kind of chaotic ghetto schools, which is problematic in a lot of ways, but I think that's what comes to mind. And if you ask, I recently spoke to a relatively new parent to the area who said that when she got here, she was a small child, she went around talking to parents, and they had, where does your child go to school? Right. And a lot of them had not even considered District 16 schools, and that's where they live, and they hadn't even visited. And actually, the District 16 schools, to be fair, often until recently were making it pretty difficult to visit and check out that school. Right. But so for whatever reason, the District 16 schools have not had a great reputation, and so they've become, and for that reason, and also because of declining population of young people, which you can attribute to the deterioration of housing and increased incarceration in areas like District 16, the enrollment has been going down for a long time.
Now let me pause right there, because we read some statistics before about it's predominantly black, and we talked about black, but it's also heavily Latino. So from what I understand, the Community School District 16, the enrollment there is over 90% black and Latino, right? What does the surrounding neighborhood look like? We're talking about Bedford-Stuyvesant. Is it as black as the community school district?
Well, the number that I have is for the community board, the community district, which is different than the community school district.
But there's some correlation.
Yeah, the community board 3 includes District 16 and a lot of and the Bed-Stuy part of District 13. Right. And the last number that I saw said the community board 3 was about 58% black, which is less than the 76% black that you said before. And some of that is from gentrification. Some of that is from in the northern part of community board 3. There's been a big increase in the Hasidic Jewish population as well. So it's not just one story, but definitely the schools are more black than the neighborhood.
Right. Okay. So the CEC has called for this moratorium, on charter schools. So also talk to me about what's going on throughout the city in terms of charter schools, but particularly in District 16. What have you heard was the reason why the CEC called for this moratorium?
Right. So the reason that charters exacerbate this existing kind of under-enrollment problem is because of this funding issue. Okay. So when a school is under-enrolled, the state is now obligated, when charters apply to have their charter approved by the state agency that does that, the city is required to find that charter school space in an existing school building, or to pay their rent in a private building, which obviously they don't want to do.
And people know that as co-location, right? They're putting charter schools in the same building as traditional public schools.
So the city bylaw has to find space for those charter schools. They go around the city looking for space, and what they find is these under-enrolled schools in districts like District 16.
So it's prime territory for charter schools to move in.
Right.
Okay.
And the charter schools show up. The charter schools have a lot of extra funding, especially the ones that are part of big charter management organizations, because they get corporate and Wall Street and foundation money. Okay. They look shinier. Right. They have higher test scores. They seem more appealing to a lot of parents. Again, the ones who are able to access that process by which you applied for the lottery and the sort of mechanisms of choice that we have. And that continues the decline in enrollment in the traditional schools, and then there's more space in those schools, and then there's more space for charters that need the space, and it perpetuates itself. Right.
So, but what's the problem? I mean, charter schools are thought of as alternatives to traditional public schools, right? And they pop up mostly in black neighborhoods, at least in New York City, and they're offering a certain kind of education. What does that education look like compared to what's being provided in traditional public schools, and why would we not be supporting that?
Well, it's not uniform. So not all charter schools have the same model by any means. Okay. I think the model that we most often associate with charter schools is one of very strict disciplinary practices, so the zero tolerance, no excuses kind of model, which you associate with, particularly with Success Academy network of charter schools. I have heard that because there's been some backlash against that some of those networks are trying to move away. But nevertheless, if you go in those schools, they're you see a lot of really strict discipline practices.
Right.
Which is something that a lot of parents rebel against, and something that doesn't work for all students. Specifically, in the last few months, there have been a series of scandals accusing particularly the Success Academy schools of what they call creaming. So even though these schools are populated by a random lottery, they have their ways, depending on who you ask, of making it so that the students who don't respond to their model, namely students with disabilities, English language learners, end up not going to those schools or not staying at those schools. So the principal, I think an administrator at a school in Fort Greene was found to have what they called a got-to-go list of students.
We've heard those reports.
And so when it is true that traditional schools have a higher percentage of students with disabilities than charter schools. It is also true that charter schools suspend students with disabilities at a slightly higher rate than traditional schools do. What happens then is that you have a higher concentration of the students who need the most resources in order to be successfully educated in traditional schools at the same moment that they're getting less resources because charters are draining those resources because of the funding. So it is a cycle that is actively to the detriment of traditional schools. I think charter parents, and I want to give people credit for, they're not happy with what they're getting at their traditional schools. They feel like they can have some agency by sending their kids to these charter schools. I get it. The problem is when that is actually to the traditional schools suffer because of that process.
And what do you think this, because we don't have a lot of time, what do you think this says about education and race and charters in New York City in general? And what do we see going on in District 16 in particular? That is, we know gentrification is surrounding a lot of what is talked about in Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights. Is this a function of gentrification at all?
It can be. This charter thing plays out differently in different places. In some places, the charters become a place for parents who move into a neighborhood, don't like their neighborhood school, so they have another option, so they can get behind the founding of a charter school, so they don't have to invest in those neighborhood schools. That's not really what's happening here. Actually, what happens more often is that the gentrifier parents tend to actually take especially in New York, because New York is a kind of liberal progressive city where there's a lot of people who say, we believe in charter schools for sort of ideological reasons. We believe in neighborhood schools for ideological reasons. They will go to a neighborhood school and kind of make that over into the kind of school that they want for their kids. So charter schools play into gentrification more so in New York, in the sense that they contribute to this under-enrollment thing, and the under-enrollment issue, what's happening in District 16 is now that there is this moratorium, there's going to be a big push to increase the enrollment of those traditional schools, which I think is great. The question is, when certain schools become more popular to a certain profile of parent, those schools eventually, and it happens faster than you would think, become so over-enrolled that then the schools become unavailable to kids from outside that zone, or the property values go up in that zone, and so the kids who were living there before can't go to that school anymore, and it's really easy for schools to really become a different school. Because there is that push. So if there is that push to increase the enrollment in the traditional schools, what are we going to do to make sure that it's not to the disadvantage of the kids and the families who already live there?
Well, there's so much more that we need to talk about, right? And we've talked about this in the past. So let's stick a pin right there, and we're going to pick up this issue probably on another episode of Brooklyn Deep here on BK Live. So thank you, Max, for coming. You've contributed to an excellent conversation that we need to keep having. So you can find more at Brooklyn Deep at brooklyndeep.org, or find us on the web. We're Brooklyn Deep on Facebook and at Brooklyn Deep, that's BKLYN Deep, on Twitter.